Download Dashlane for free if you never want to forget another password again at the link in the description. Aomori, Japan, 1936. Prisoner Yoshie Shiratori had had enough. He was forced to confess to a murder he did not commit, falsely imprisoned in Aomori prison, beaten and tortured every night by prison guards, and, now worse, prosecutors were seeking the death penalty. In his mind, it was time to go, but Aomori prison wasn't the easiest to escape. Regardless, Yoshie Shiratori had nothing to lose, and so at 5:30 a.m. he made his move. He knew there would be a 15-minute gap in the patrol time, as he had studied the guard's routine for months. And when the coast was clear, he pulled out a metal wire which he had smuggled in from the bathhouse and started to pick the lock. This was originally the metal support ring that was wrapped around the bathing buckets inmates used to wash themselves. His hands were stiff from the wintry cold, but after a few minutes of picking, he had success, and his cell door swung.
This guy just happens to know how to lockpick. Okay.
Open. But he wasn't out of the woods yet, because there were more locked doors ahead. He knew he only had a few minutes left before the guards would return, and so he wasted no time attempting to pick his way through the remaining security doors. Now, fortunately for him, he was able to make it out of the facility, but the bad news was that he was only halfway to freedom. You see, he was still well within the search perimeter, which meant at any moment the alarm could go off and he'd still be caught. At 5:45 a.m., the guards returned, peering into his cell, and this is what they saw. Shiratori sound asleep in his futon bed. But of course, what they didn't realize was that they were looking at something else, a pile of loose floorboards underneath his duvet designed to trick them. It wasn't until the next morning that they finally discovered the truth, and the alarm was sounded. But by then, Shiratori was long gone. Now, he had escaped, but if you've watched any of our previous videos, you'll know that things aren't always as they seem. In fact, for Yoshie Shiratori, aka the prison break magician, this was only the beginning. 3 days later, he was caught trying to steal supplies from a hospital, and just like that, he was back in the slammer. But this time, for his escape attempt, he was sentenced to life in prison. He would never be with his family again, his wife and his daughter, and all the months of planning had led to just 3 days of freedom. It now seemed he'd be locked up for a very long time. 6 years later, in 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, Shiratori found himself transferred to Akita Prison in Akita City. There, the guards treated him even worse than in Aomori. They had heard about Shiratori's previous escape and were determined to make an example out of him. They wanted to make sure he would never escape again. Along with the usual beatings, he was forced to partake in extreme manual labor, made to sleep on the hard concrete floor in the severe winter cold, and placed into solitary confinement for extended periods of time. Now, this was a specially made solitary confinement cell, which was very small and had a very high ceiling, with the walls covered with copper sheets so smooth that it was impossible to grip. In addition, there was almost no sunlight even in the daytime, with the only window light coming from a small sealed skylight high above. This was a room designed to keep escape artists from escaping, and if that wasn't enough, the guards also made sure that Shiratori was handcuffed at all times. Now, despite the constant abuse, one of the guards, Kobayashi, in fact the head guard, took pity on him. Kobayashi never laid a finger, and even seemed to check up on him from time to time, concerned for his well-being. Perhaps this made life a little more bearable for Shiratori, and it might have even been what kept his will alive all the way to
the head guard just tell the other guards to fuck off.
Night of June 15th. It was a stormy night, and Shiratori was in the middle of one of his extended stays in solitary confinement. At around midnight, one of the guards peered into his cell and couldn't believe his eyes. He opened the cell door and looked around in astonishment, as Yoshie Shiratori had vanished into thin air. All that was left was his handcuffs. So how did he do it? Well, there were a few assumptions the guards made that did not apply to Shiratori. For one, handcuffs simply didn't work on him. Shiratori was actually a master of getting out of handcuffs, and in fact had several methods to choose from. Here, he decided to go with the familiar lockpicking.
So this guy's an expert lockpicker. He can get out of the handcuffs, but he didn't actually commit the crime.
Method. but he really could have gone with
That's
any
very
of them.
interesting.
He had thoroughly scoured his surroundings to find anything that could be of use in an escape, and just like in Aomori prison, he was able to uncover a loose bit of wire. Perhaps it was from one of the items Kobayashi brought him, but this wasn't clear. After freeing himself from the cuffs, he placed his palms and soles of his feet on the smooth copper sheets and started climbing the unclimbable wall.
What?
It turned out Shiratori was also an expert climber with an uncanny ability to scale like
This
a
guy's
lizard.
just a super.
Once he reached the skylight above, he noticed that, yes, the window was sealed, but the wooden framing around it was starting to rot. And so thereafter, night after night, when the guards weren't looking, he'd climb the copper walls and loosen the framing, bit by bit. Afterwards, he'd climb back down and place the handcuffs back on, as to not rouse suspicion. After a couple months, the window finally came loose, and from there, it was just about choosing the right day. He waited until a particular stormy night, so the guards wouldn't hear the footsteps on the roof. And that was it. He had escaped from prison
See ya.
again. Now this time, he wouldn't be caught. Or, at least, not in the way you'd expect. 3 months later, on September 18th, the head guard, Kobayashi, was at home when he heard a knock on the door. To his surprise, it was the fugitive Yoshie Shiratori, unkempt and disheveled, and he needed a favor. A stunned Kobayashi took him in and fed him, all the while listening to what he had to say. Shiratori explained that he didn't actually mind being in prison, and that the only reason he escaped twice now was due to the tremendous abuse he suffered at the hands of the sadistic guards. Kobayashi, however, was the only one who treated him with any amount of respect, and so he felt he owed it to him to let him in on his grand plan. Now, this plan involved Shiratori willingly, yes, handing himself over to the Justice Department, where he could then personally make a case for how corrupt and barbaric the Japanese prison system was, and there needed to be reform. He wanted to campaign for change, and in the process, gain his legal freedom through a civil lawsuit. He felt this was the only way he could realistically end up with his family. This, of course, was a super ambitious plan, and as a fugitive on the run, he was well aware of that, which is why he needed Kobayashi, the well-respected head guard of Akita prison, to vouch for him, to strengthen his credibility. As the only guard who ever treated him right, he had a feeling Kobayashi would do the right thing.
Yikes.
Minutes later, while Shiratori was in the toilet, Kobayashi called the police. Maybe not a great plan. Just like that, Shiratori was back in prison, and this time, he vowed never to trust an officer of the law again. For the second escape, the courthouse added 3 more years to his life sentence. Now, Shiratori requested to be sent to a Tokyo prison, where the weather was warmer, as he couldn't stand the cold in the northern prisons. His previous stints had weakened him severely, but he was denied his request. Instead, the judge sentenced him to the infamous Abashiri prison in Hokkaido, the northernmost prison in Japan.
Not
No
that
man had ever
Abashiri.
escaped from this wintry hellhole of a prison. It was now 1943, and the cold was unbearable in Abashiri, as the temperature in the cells was below freezing point. Whenever inmates received their prison food, the miso soup and soy sauce would often freeze up. In this temperature, a handcuffed Shiratori was thrown into an open cell in summer clothing, and he immediately felt the paralyzing sting of cold air. Perhaps in a fit of desperation, he tried to force himself past the guards, but they were able to push him back and beat him down. An enraged and defiant Shiratori stood back up and vowed that he would escape from Abashiri prison, like he's always done, and that there was nothing they could do about it. In fact, he claimed there was little point even putting handcuffs on him, as he'd always find a way to break free. If not by lockpicking, then, well, this. He then proceeded to rip apart the chain of his handcuffs, to the horror of the guards. It turned out Shiratori had another special ability. Aside from his outstanding climbing abilities, he also possessed incredible strength, almost superhuman strength.
Is this
Back in
big? Is this a big story, guys?
Akita prison, he could have broken free of the cuffs the physical way if he didn't have to put them back on. Now, this was impressive, but it wasn't so smart to lay his cards on the table like that, as the guards were starting to build an escape profile on him. They knew he had lockpicking abilities, lizard-like climbing abilities, and now almost superhuman strength. And so they set out to devise the ultimate escape-proof cell, one that was sure to be Shiratori-proof. And they came up with this. The new cell had steel fixtures with a low chance of rot. Any openings, even the bars removed, were made smaller than his body. meaning there was no way he could physically fit through. He had specially made solid iron handcuffs that tied his hands behind his back, and leg cuffs that made him barely able to stand. These cuffs weighed 20 kgs each and had no
Jesus.
keyhole, which meant they could not be lockpicked.
Let me guess,
And
he
the only way
escapes
they
this.
could be removed was by 2 metalwork specialists who would come once every few weeks to remove them in an arduous 2-hour process.
Wow.
It was at this point, and only this point, that he could even take a bath. And he certainly needed one, as weeks of being shackled up with no movement meant his cuff wounds were infested with maggots. On top of
Oh.
that, and as cold as it had already been, it wasn't even peak winter yet. Any strength he would have left would surely be nullified by the upcoming freeze. Though just in case, they still made
guy's
sure to
just killing
cut
him.
his already meager food portions in half. And so that was it. Even for Shiratori, this was too much.
Yeah.
As winter came, he succumbed to his fate. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through the opening, and he'd be forced to grovel like a dog. His hand and leg cuffs made every action awkward and uncomfortable, with even sleeping being a pain. There was no doubt life in Abashiri prison was absolute torture. Now, fast forward. Shiratori was somehow able to survive through the winter, and spring was coming. This meant he was starting to get his strength back. But still, what could he really do? He was literally in a bind. Months passed and, well, nothing seemed
tricky.
to happen. Then one night, in August, a guard in his office was
I mean,
doing
I
some
see the fucking
paperwork
solution.
when he heard some shuffling on the roof. He wasn't sure what it was, but he decided to check on the prisoners. As he looked inside Shiratori's inescapable cell, he was stunned. The futon bed and prison garments were neatly folded up. The specially made 20 kg handcuffs and leg cuffs that would have required 2 specialists 2 hours to remove was placed on the side.
What?
And Shiratori was nowhere to be seen. He had finally fulfilled his promise to the guards. The alarm immediately sounded, but despite the work of the search
That's
party,
genius.
it seemed he had truly disappeared. But how on earth did this happen? How did he escape from the fortress that was Abashiri prison? Well, preparation had started 6 months earlier. At the time, he didn't have the strength or stamina to mount any sort of escape, not to mention the restraints he was in. But one thing he did have was time and patience. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through, and while he struggled to eat his food off the floor, he always made sure to save a little bit of the miso soup in the corner. You see, every night, he would hobble awkwardly to the inspection window and splash a little of it on the steel frame. He would also dab some on his handcuffs and leg cuffs. Now, his intention was for the salt content of the miso soup to oxidize the screws and bolts, eventually corroding and loosening it. After a month, this
No
technique
way.
of rusting through the iron actually worked, and the first screw came out. The next few months saw screws and bolts coming loose, assisted by the use of the first screw as a sort of screwdriver. By the end of spring, he was able to fully remove his handcuffs and leg cuffs, as well as the steel frame of the inspection window. But there was a problem. The size of the opening was smaller than his body, which meant he couldn't fit through, a contingency thought out by the guards. What they didn't account for, though, was Shiratori's fourth ability,
Dude.
which involved being able to dislocate his joints at will. With this, he was now able to slide through the opening like a caterpillar. This repertoire of skills, thus surely making him an honorary member of the X-Men.
Yeah,
With that,
what the hell?
he climbed through a broken window in the roof and vanished.
Dislocate
Impressively, Shiratori
your
had now
own
escaped
stuff.
from 3 prisons, as well as being the only man to ever escape Abashiri prison. Now, good on him for escaping, but this was northern Hokkaido, and the only direction he could have gone to was the cold, snowy mountains. Actually, the prison guards felt that they had the last laugh, because if the cold didn't get him, the mountain bears certainly would. Despite this likelihood, there was one person who stayed hopeful, and that was Shiratori's wife. But she was still worried, because even if he was alive, she knew he wouldn't be able to make it back to his family, as the authorities would be constantly on his tail. Which is why she was desperately and secretly hoping that Japan would lose the war, as that would enable the US to take over the country, meaning everyone would likely forget about her husband. Of course, she kept this to herself, but then a year later, in August 1945,
Yep.
she got her wish. The Americans had now taken over the country's penitentiary system, and sweeping changes were being made. And it did seem,
Yep.
perhaps, that the manhunt for Yoshie Shiratori had now taken a back seat. Yet the question remained, where was he? And was he even alive?
Yes, he was.
The answer was yes, he was alive, and living a solitary life. This time, self-imposed. It turned out he had discovered an abandoned mine on a mountainside in the Hokkaido wilderness, and was able to make a home for himself. For food, he lived off nuts and berries, wild rabbits and raccoons, and was even able to learn to catch crabs from a stream by observing the habits of bears. Life was steady and safe, but after a while, curiosity got the better of him. And so after 2 years of isolation, he made his way down the mountain to a nearby village.
Yes.
What he saw astounded him. The streets were filled with signs written in English. The posters and flags, emblematic of the war effort, had vanished. And even more strange, young Japanese girls were holding hands with American soldiers. What on earth was going on? He grabbed a newspaper that had been set aside, flipped through the pages, and it was only then that he found out about the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered the previous year, and he couldn't believe it. As with his wife, he felt it was now pointless to hide, and so bid farewell to his old hunter-gatherer lifestyle. He headed south of Abashiri for the next 50 days, until he reached the city of Sapporo. At this point, he was starving, so he found himself a nice ripe tomato from a nearby field, which was a huge mistake. A farmer had spotted him and mistook him for a well-known local thief, which led to a scuffle, resulting in the farmer's abdomen being pierced by a blade. Sadly, he bled out and died, but not before Shiratori was arrested for the crime. It wasn't long until police found out that they in fact had the infamous Yoshie Shiratori in their custody. For his multiple escapes and having now murdered the farmer, despite his claims of self-defense, he was sentenced to death by the district court of
No
Sapporo.
way.
And in 1947, he was sent to Sapporo prison to await execution.
He escapes
Now, to
again.
ensure he wouldn't escape this time while on death row, he was placed under 24-hour surveillance, with 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch. As for the cell itself, it was upgraded further from the one in Abashiri prison, with reinforced doors, ceilings, bars, windows. In fact, any openings were made smaller than the size of his head, not just his body, learning from the Abashiri escape, as while he may be able to dislocate his joints, he certainly can't dislocate his skull.
Well-
as long as his head can't fit, they were good. The
This
6
guy
guards
might
were
be able-
so confident, in fact, that they didn't even bother cuffing him. Now, Shiratori was getting old, and the odds of escaping by this point were looking slim. As his execution loomed near, there was little he could really do, and the guards knew that. They could see the desperation on his face, looking up, searching for an escape plan that they knew would never come. Though, still, just in case, they made sure to search his room every night while he was taking a bath in the bathhouse, inspecting the ceiling, skylight, and any other openings. A month passed, and winter was now coming, weakening him further, and the realization was starting to dawn on him. He grew increasingly despondent, staying in bed, refusing to wake up, despite the orders of the guards. This went on for a while, until one morning, the guards had enough and entered the cell to discipline him. They flipped over the duvet, and he was gone.
What?
This was not possible. How did he do it this time? Going back to when he was first placed under 24-hour surveillance with the 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch, he had in fact conditioned them to look up and keep up from the very start. Not just because his previous escape attempts involved climbing through skylight windows on ceilings, but also his suspicious yet, as it turned out, very intentional behavior of constantly looking up to figure out an escape plan. Little did they know, it was all an act, and that he already had one, but it would be taking place precisely where they weren't
Damn.
looking. You see, it turned out the authorities were so concerned with him escaping through a window or skylight that they neglected to reinforce the bottom. This ironically ended up being his easiest and simplest escape, because all he had to do was remove the bolted floorboards, which wasn't easy but he had experience, and using random cutlery and a miso soup bowl, dig his way to freedom. This took over a month, and he was able to hide his activities due to A, the guards not suspecting this approach, and B, the floorboard panels being put back in place every night after digging. The 6 guards thought they were keeping a good eye on him even at night, but with the hole consistently positioned underneath the futon and duvet, and it increasingly becoming the norm to refuse the orders of the guards to wake up, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Placing a pile of loose floorboards underneath the duvet to trick them was also a callback to his first prison escape in Aomori. So he had now escaped from prison
Wow.
4 times, and by this point, the story is starting to get ridiculous. That
That's
this
crazy.
perpetual cycle of capture and escape was about to end. Because a year later, in 1948, Shiratori was exhausted.
No way, you're
30
captured
million
again.
people
Really?
around the world are just like me.
Vanguard.
There's no way you got captured.
He was in his 40s now, and this was a young man's game. One day, in the Kotoni neighborhood, still in Sapporo, as he stopped to rest, a policeman just happened to sit by his side for a smoke. He didn't know who Shiratori was, but he struck up a conversation with him. Shiratori, of course, was wary of his presence and tried to play it cool, all the while attempting to figure out a way to remove himself from the situation without being suspicious. Suddenly, the policeman did something unexpected, at least to him. He pulled out another cigarette and offered it to him. Shiratori was stunned. You see, cigarettes were expensive luxury items in Japan at the time, and the fact that someone offered it to him just out of the kindness of his heart brought tears to his eyes. Not to mention all his life he had been abused and mistreated by officers of the law, with even the head guard Kobayashi turning his back on him. And here was an instance of an officer treating him kindly, with respect, and with no prejudgment. As he smoked the cigarette, Shiratori couldn't help but tell the officer his full name, Yoshie Shiratori, and that he had escaped from Sapporo prison last year. In fact, he had escaped from prison 4 times in his life. It was strangely a relief to get it all off his chest, and he was even ready for the consequences. After the Kobayashi incident, he had vowed never to trust another officer of the
No
law
way.
again.
He's not
the
a
simple
snitch.
act of receiving a cigarette from a stranger broke him. Of course, he was arrested again, but this time, things were different. Maybe it was the fact that he willingly gave himself up, or that Japan's justice system was going through a change. But the High Court of Sapporo became sympathetic to Shiratori's plight, and some of his past claims were recognized, such as acknowledging the farmer's death as a legitimate case of self-defense. They also made note that throughout all 4 of his prison escapes, he didn't kill or injure a single guard, despite the abuse he may have suffered at their hands. At the end of the deliberation, the High Court dismissed the murder charge, revoking his death sentence, and instead sentenced him to just 20 years in prison.
They
Further,
didn't do any
they
of it.
approved his request to be transferred to a Tokyo prison, where the weather was warmer. He was getting what he wanted. In Tokyo, he was sent to Fuchu prison, where, for the first time, the guards actually treated him well. It was a weird feeling. There were all these precautions and security measures in place to ensure that the infamous prison break magician wouldn't escape. But the truth was, Shiratori didn't really care anymore. Everything he'd been fighting against, the mistreatment from guards, the death penalty,
Is that because
even the
America
northern
took
climate,
over the
was no longer of concern,
prison system?
and he was at peace. There was no need to escape anymore. He finally accepted his punishment, and for the remainder of his sentence, acted as a model prisoner. Just 14 years later, in 1961, he was released on parole, and for the first time in a long time, he was truly a free man. He decided to head back to Aomori, where it all began, and meet up with his daughter, who, by this point, unfortunately, was the only family member he had left.
No.
For his incredible escapes, Yoshie Shiratori became a legend, an
Why's
anti-hero
dying?
in Japan. But it was very much the opposite for the country's penitentiary system, which had somehow allowed him to escape time and time again. This was a national embarrassment for Japan. But just as preventing criminals from breaking out of the system is vital for the safety of society, so is preventing them from breaking into the system. Your system, that is. And for that, I'd personally recommend
Okay.
Dashlane. Because Dashlane makes
That was
keeping
very
track of all-
interesting. But there's no one ever who's come close to him. Like nowadays. Security is way tighter. Way tighter. Kind of a sad story though. Like how corrupt everything was. Very sad. And he would have kept in prison if the war didn't go the way it was. Which is absolutely insane.
I'm Kento Bento. This will be part 1 of a 2-part series, and is made possible by Nebula and CuriosityStream.
True
Tokyo,
story.
March 1970. 31,000 feet up in the air, Japan Airlines Flight 351 was reaching its cruising altitude. It had left Tokyo's Haneda Airport no more than 10 minutes ago and was set to land in Fukuoka in an hour's time. This was to be a relatively short flight, a domestic affair. But little did the passengers and crew know it was going to be neither, as Japan Airlines Flight 351 was about to undergo a harrowing ordeal. On the plane were 122 passengers, tourists, businessmen, first-year uni students, doctors on their way to medical conferences, really people from all walks of life, and including a few notable individuals like the high-ranking Pepsi executive,
Whoa.
a talented bass player from the up-and-coming rock band Hadaka no Rarize,
No
and
way.
a Roman Catholic priest from New York. Yes, this was a
God, I know
diverse
all of
mix
them.
with people of varied experiences and professions, but nothing could have prepared them for what was to come. At about 7:30 a.m., as the plane was flying over the southern face of Mount Fuji, a young Japanese man got up from his seat to make a special announcement. He was hijacking the plane. This man was Takamaro Tamiya, a 27-year-old recent graduate. Now, this announcement wasn't met with as much terror and panic as one would expect, as this was the year 1970, when airline hijackings weren't illegal. It wasn't yet considered an international crime. Yes, people were concerned, and some more than others, but the general attitude towards aircraft piracy was not how it is today. But this was about to change, as Takamaro Tamiya proceeded to pull out a samurai sword. Yes, a samurai sword.
What the fuck?
He was for real. The seriousness of the situation was now apparent to all. Despite this, 122 passengers was a lot for a single hijacker, which is why he didn't come alone. With everyone now in a state of panic, Tamiya's accomplices began to make themselves known one by one. The university students had revealed themselves. Now, this was unexpected and bizarre. Many of the students were still in their early years at Tokyo and Kyoto universities, two of the most prestigious universities in all of Japan, with the youngest among them being just 16 years old, actually still in high school. Just like their leader Tamiya, they wielded samurai swords, but not just that, some had pistols and homemade pipe bombs as well. This was confusing and terrifying. As they tried to break into the cockpit, the distressed pilots radioed in for help, relaying the dire situation on board. It seemed it wasn't long until the hijackers would make their way in. The rest of the students were now tying the male passengers down to their seats as ordered by their leader. Now, it was certainly an odd sight to see such young Japanese recruits involved in this act of terror,
I see how it
9
is.
in total. But the most surprising of all, perhaps, was the identity of one particular hijacker. He was the bass player of the up-and-coming rock band Hadaka no Rarize. This wasn't a joke. His name was Moriaki Wakabayashi, and he was in it just as much as his fellow comrades. It was time
Wakabayashi.
to end things. With the cockpit finally breached and the pilots restrained, the samurai skyjackers were now in full control of Japan Airlines Flight 351. Now, it's hard to imagine airline security being so lax as to allow samurai swords, pistols, and pipe bombs to be this easily
Yeah, that's
smuggled
crazy.
onto a plane. But 1970 was a different time, and well, the demands of the hijackers reflected that. You see, the reason they took control of the plane was to fly it across the Pacific Ocean to the Caribbean, specifically to Havana, Cuba. This was to be their final destination. With Cuba being a communist haven led by revolutionary Fidel Castro, the 9 men wanted to make a grand political statement to the world, hijacking a passenger airliner right out of Tokyo and diverting it to Cuba, the country of their dreams. As members of the Japanese Red Army faction, a communist militant group hell-bent on overthrowing the Japanese government and the monarchy, they wanted to establish contact with revolutionary forces in Cuba so that they could receive specialized military training for the impending revolutionary war they would wage upon returning to Japan. They claimed they loved their country, and this was the only way. But on top of that, they were hoping the act would inspire and promote rebellion across the rest of Asia. And this was just the beginning. Really, they wanted to start a world revolution, and they were willing to advocate it through terror and violence. After all, they had already long threatened to wage civil war in Tokyo and Osaka, and had previously been involved in violent street battles and a few small-scale bombings. Hijackings were their next venture, and these 9 men, young men, were the frontrunners. They had been targeted and scouted from leftist student groups from universities across Tokyo and Kyoto, and were now ready and willing to give everything to the cause. And yes, this included Moriaki Wakabayashi, the bass player of the rock group Hadaka no Rarize, which started off as a university band before their rise in popularity. Now, perhaps it was this very youthful
This is
inexperience
crazy.
and overconfidence that led to their first lapse in judgment, which awkwardly enough had to be explained to them by the pilot. You see, it was just not possible for the plane to make it all the way to Cuba,
Not enough
even
fuel.
close. Why? Well, Japan Airlines Flight 351 was a Boeing 727 airliner, which was designed for short to medium range flights only, not for one making its way halfway across the world in a single trip. The plane was simply not constructed to cross the Pacific, much less to Cuba. And this was shocking to the hijackers, as they simply hadn't expected this turn of events. They needed a plan B fast, one that involved an alternate destination. But, well, even that appeared to be out of the question, as the pilots quickly informed them of an even more pressing concern. The plane was running out of fuel. They only had
Yeah.
enough for the original destination,
That's what I thought.
Fukuoka. Tamiya had to think on his feet. Time was ticking. Right, well, if they had to land in Fukuoka, then they'd land in Fukuoka, but on their terms. Now, it was about this time that the Japanese Ministry of Transport received word of the hijacking, and was entrusted with the task of ensuring the safety of all the passengers. A member of the department, Vice Minister Shinjiro Yamamura, would directly oversee the hostage recovery efforts. Of course, word also got around to the news outlets, who quickly reported on the incident live. This was a first for Japan, as
Well-
never before had they experienced the hijacking of an airplane. This shocked and horrified the entire nation. At 9 a.m., Japan Airlines Flight 351 touched down at Fukuoka Airport, where they were met by a horde of spectators and members of the media. The authorities wasted no time in surrounding the plane, as they readied themselves for the eventual standoff.
There's no
With
way it's gonna
129
work.
hostages on board,
Surely.
122 passengers, and 7 crew members, the hijackers felt that they had the upper hand.
No.
But it all would rest on the negotiations. As Yamamura and the authorities prepared themselves, the negotiations began. For the next few hours, the two sides went back and forth, both unwilling to budge, with Tamiya threatening to kill every last one of the hostages if his demands weren't met.
Good.
This was an intense negotiation, with a lot at stake, but eventually, an agreement was reached. So the deal was for the hijackers to release 23 of the passengers in exchange for more fuel. But it had to be enough fuel to get them to their new destination. Now, Havana, Cuba, was no longer an option. It was too far. So they had to settle for one within reach. After much discussion and consideration, they decided on Pyongyang. The hijackers were going to North Korea.
What?
Now, this made sense to the 9 men, as North Korea was another communist regime, ruled by another great revolutionary, Kim Il-sung, grandfather to Kim Jong-un. They reasoned that flying the plane to Pyongyang would still make a grand political statement to the world. Furthermore, they had actually already planned for a brief stopover in Pyongyang, as the city had been a serious candidate to host their base of operations for their international revolution, and they wanted to conduct some reconnaissance while en route to Cuba. So all this just meant a slightly longer detour to North Korea. No big deal, really. Once the dust had settled, they'd figure out another way to Cuba. Viva la revolution! And so the deal was done. Tamiya got what he wanted, and even better, they still had 106 hostages on board for leverage. On the Japanese side, all the passengers released were women, children, and the elderly, the most vulnerable, which was fortunate, but not quite
gonna
what
say,
they had hoped
children,
for.
though.
The
Boys
majority on the
first.
plane were still very much in jeopardy. But now, it was time to go. With the pilots having never flown to North Korea and unable to rely on Pyongyang air control for guidance, Fukuoka airport officials had to quickly pass them a map of the Korean peninsula to navigate for themselves. That would have to do for now. But with that, Japan Airlines Flight 351 fueled up and took off,
This would
bound
be-
for the Hermit Kingdom.
This would be so different now.
Now, aside from the Japanese, there was actually one other group that was rather unhappy with the outcome thus far, and that was the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. You see,
Yeah.
Langley had sent over agents for their own hostage recovery mission, as there were a couple of US nationals on board, the Pepsi executive Herbert Brill, and the Roman Catholic priest from New York, Daniel MacDonald. They had business to attend to in Fukuoka, but now, with the plane heading towards North Korea, a nation known for their international hostility and political reclusiveness, not to mention their general hatred and contempt towards Americans, things weren't looking great.
Probably should have
By
got them
now,
off the
Flight
plane.
351 was well on its way to Pyongyang. It had crossed the Tsushima Strait, flown over the Korean mountain ranges, and had just about reached the DMZ, the Korean Demilitarized Zone. This 38th parallel is the contested border dividing the Korean peninsula into North and South Korea. Once past this point, there would be no turning back. But on top of that, the pilots were having a hard time with navigation, as they were unfamiliar with the flight route. Seeing as the countries had no diplomatic ties, Japanese airlines and airport controllers were simply unable to make contact with their North Korean counterparts. The Japanese pilots didn't even know where the airport in Pyongyang was located. Sure, they were given a map by airport officials shortly before leaving Fukuoka, but they were astounded to discover it was just a basic line map taken from a junior high school textbook. It
Oh
had
my
little to no
God.
detail, certainly no aviation map. The airport officials understandably had little time to prepare, but this was ridiculous. There was no way they could fly to North Korea using this map. Moreover, the North Koreans had no idea they were even coming.
They're gonna
a
get
major
shot
cause
down.
for concern. It's common knowledge among pilots that the airspace above the DMZ is a no-fly zone, with a long-running formal agreement that any aircraft entering could be shot down
Yeah.
for any reason, with no grounds for redress. If this were to happen, it would surely precipitate an international incident. As such, the pilots tried desperately to make contact with the Pyongyang control tower, attempting to warn them of their unique circumstances. Pyongyang, please respond. Pyongyang, this is JA Flight 351, Pyongyang, please respond. Nothing. The pilots frantically warned the hijackers of the potential fiery end they could meet if they were to fly any further, but Tommy insisted they continue. He was steadfast in their revolutionary mission, even proclaiming that North Korea was no threat to them, as he would personally recruit Kim Il-sung to the Japanese Red Army, if need be. And so, the pilots had no choice. With samurai swords pointing at their necks, and with permission yet to be granted by Pyongyang, Japan
Bro,
Airlines
you're
Flight
just gonna get
351
blown up.
entered
The fuck
the
don't you
DMZ.
understand, man? Oh.
Moments later, North Korean fighter jets emerged from the clouds, opening fire at the passenger plane. They had entered North Korean airspace. But just like that, it was over. The firing stopped. The pilots realized, well, it must have been warning fire. At that moment, there was a faint response on the radio. This is Pyongyang. This is Pyongyang. Respond. Respond. It was in English, but in a heavy Korean accent. The pilots, relieved at finally making contact, tried their hardest to explain their predicament to the Pyongyang control tower. This must have sounded quite bizarre to the North Koreans, as nothing like this had ever happened before. But, despite the unusual request, after some back and forth, Flight 351 was permitted to land in Pyongyang.
What?
They would, however, be closely escorted by the fighter jets. Now, the hijackers were elated. This was what they had hoped for, acceptance from their communist allies. But as the plane continued flying deeper and deeper into the reclusive state, it was becoming quite clear to the rest of those on board, the passengers and crew, that their fate no longer rested in the hands of the hijackers,
Yeah, I was gonna
the
say.
Hermit Kingdom.
They're in a different place now.
At 3:19 p.m.,
Hey, the
Japan
boss.
Airlines Flight 351 touched down at Mirim Airport in East Pyongyang, where they were met by a swarm of military personnel. There were North Korean soldiers, policemen, high-ranking officials, but also, surprisingly, sympathetic crowds of civilians holding out welcome signs, as well as a choir of schoolgirls singing North Korean greeting songs, welcoming the hijackers, or, in their eyes, defectors, to their glorious nation. Outside the aircraft, an
What?
announcement could be heard, blasting over the loudspeakers. This is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, presided by the great leader Kim Il-sung. For those who are fighting against Japanese imperialism, we welcome you. This was a somewhat elaborate reception, and a magnificent sight for the student radicals, but for the hostages, it was deeply unsettling.
They're
It
screwed.
wasn't long until a North Korean official approached the plane to officially receive the foreign visitors. This was it. Tommy and his men were about to join their communist brethren. Now, meanwhile, in a nearby hangar, the Japanese authorities and the CIA were getting ready to launch their rescue mission. It was now or never. All that was needed was for the 9 men to be lured far enough away from the plane by the fake North Korean official. This was what it had all been leading
Oh my
up
god,
to.
they got a
You
fake.
see, the hijackers had indeed ended up in the Korean capital, but there was just one problem. It was the wrong one. Back in Fukuoka, the Japanese authorities and the CIA failed to recover all the hostages. The negotiations did not go as planned, but there was absolutely no way they were going to let 106 Japanese and American hostages fly right into the heart of North Korea.
I was gonna say.
Instead, they opted for the Seoul. They knew they wouldn't have
Wow.
long till the plane ended up in North Korean airspace, so they had to think on their feet. Time was ticking. Right, well, if the plane had to land in Pyongyang, then they'd land in Pyongyang, but on their terms. This was their plan B. With the negotiations over, they sprung
Wow.
into action. First thing, they needed to get the South Koreans on board. If they were going to pull this off, there needed to be exhaustive cooperation between all 3 countries, Japan, the US, and South Korea, something the hijackers could never have imagined. They had less than an hour to get this done. Now,
Yeah.
on the plane, the pilots were attempting to navigate to Pyongyang, but they were astounded to discover the map they were given was unusable, a basic line map taken from a junior high school textbook. There was no way they could fly to North Korea with this. As the captain was about to throw the map away, he suddenly notices a handwritten note at the top corner. No aviation map, but tune into frequency 121.5 megacycles. He did as instructed. Not long after entering the DMZ, North Korean fighter jets emerged from the clouds, firing anti-aircraft shells at the passenger plane. Or at least, that's who those on board thought was firing at them. In reality, this was the South Korean Air Force attempting to fool the hijackers into thinking they had now entered North Korean airspace. Having tuned into the frequency 121.5 megacycles, the pilots and the hijackers then received a message from who they thought was the Pyongyang control tower. This is Pyongyang. Respond, respond. Spoken in a heavy Korean accent. This was, however, sent by air traffic control in Seoul. To this day, because of differing accounts of the situation, it's still unknown to the extent to which the pilots were aware of this ruse. Perhaps they were in the dark just as much as the hijackers, or perhaps they were key coordinators of the plan themselves. Regardless, what we do know is that following the instructions that were received on frequency
I bet if they got into North Korea, they would have just got blown up. No hesitation.
5 megacycles, the pilots were able to safely direct Flight 351 back across the DMZ, eventually touching down at Gimpo International Airport in Seoul. That was the reason for the rudimentary map, because the Japanese authorities never planned for the pilots to use it at all. They were never going to Pyongyang. Now the countdown was on. The hour was almost up. As the plane touched down on the runway, the South Korean airport officials were frantically putting the finishing touches on their makeshift renovation. You see, the final piece of the deception involved disguising Seoul's Gimpo airport to look like one in Pyongyang. They did this by covering up any South Korean related items and branding, and removing all South Korean flags, replacing them with North Korean flags. South Korean police were also dressed up in communist uniforms and North Korean military attire, and random actors performing the role of the sympathetic public held up welcome signs in the hopes of putting the hijackers at ease. A crowd of girls from a nearby school was even cast to sing North Korean greeting songs to add as much authenticity as possible. This was the best they could do given the time. Blasting over the loudspeakers, "This is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, presided by the great leader Kim Il-sung. For those who are fighting against Japanese imperialism, we welcome you." The fake North Korean official approached the plane, greeting the hijackers with a megaphone.
That's amazing.
"We have prepared a shuttle bus to take you, the revolutionary heroes, to meet the great leader and premier Kim Il-sung." The Japanese, American, and South Korean authorities, meanwhile, were waiting in the wings. Vice Minister Yamamura was ready. With the ramp stairs rolled up to the fuselage, the hijackers prepared to disembark. They were riding high. This was what they had been waiting for. After sacrificing everything to the cause, their moment had come. This was a revolutionary victory for the ages. One by one, they made their way to the exit. What they didn't know, though, was that their struggles were far from over. This was only the beginning. Now, the rest of this incredible story will be covered in part 2.
Alright, if you want to see a part
on
2,
YouTube in a few weeks. So
drop
make
a
sure
like
you have notifications
and
turned on. But there's actually another video coming out even sooner that you
leave a
can
comment
watch,
down below.
the prequel events. If you want to know all about what led up to the hijacking
That was
of Japan Airlines
amazing.
Flight 351, who the mastermind was, why Tamiya was never supposed to be the leader, how the Japanese authorities watched on as the hijackers boarded the plane in Tokyo's Haneda Airport. Yep, they knew. Well, you can check out this special prequel video exclusive to Nebula. It'll be coming out in April. There's a whole story to be told before they even step foot on the plane. And well, you can also check out there what many are calling my best video ever, the shocking Chinese pork bun murders, my Nebula original. But warning, it's terrifying. Of course,
murders. I have to watch that at some point. Alright, thanks guys for watching. Bye.